That is the lesson. That is the legacy. That is the meaning of Aesopian language. Remember it well, perhaps you will be next. The world is still full of wolves and lambs, and it desperately needs more shepherds. Learn the language, see the truth, and when your moment comes, and it will come, be brave enough to use whatever power you have in service of justice. And in every generation, some young person sitting in a classroom or walking through streets lined with the displaced and dispossessed will suddenly see clearly, will suddenly understand, will suddenly know that they must act. I was that young person once. This is the meaning of the wolf and the lamb. This is why, more than 2,000 years later, people still tell the story, still ask the questions, still struggle with the same eternal conflict between power and justice. The fable continues. The question remains. Some injustices, once seen, must be challenged. Some fables, once understood, become more than stories. They become calls to action, blueprints for resistance, testaments to the possibility of something better. This is the lesson of Aesopian language. That lesson shaped my life, gave me a way of seeing that I could never unsee, burdened me with knowledge that I could not ignore. It cost me everything, and I would not change a single moment of it, because some truths, once learned, demand to be acted upon. I learned about Aesopian language when I was 12 years old, in a classroom by the Temple of Saturn, from a teacher whose name most people have forgotten. The choice, as always, is yours. But remember, not choosing is itself a choice. Silence is a choice. Acceptance is a choice. And those choices have consequences, not just for you, but for everyone the wolves would devour if no one stands against them. The question is always the same. What will you do about it? Will you be a wolf, using power to exploit? Will you be a lamb, accepting victimhood as inevitable? Or will you be a shepherd, using whatever power you have to protect, to serve, to change? This is the lesson I pass on to you, whoever you are, reading this story across the centuries. The wolf and the lamb is not just a fable, it is reality, repeated in every age, in every society, wherever power is concentrated and the powerless suffer. He learned that injustice must be spoken about, must be confronted, must be challenged. He learned that silence in the face of wrong is itself a kind of wrong. He learned that those who have the power to act have the responsibility to act, and even now, even after death. I believe it was worth it, because the boy who learned about Aesopian language in a classroom by the Forum did not just learn how to speak indirectly about injustice, but for a moment, for one shining, terrifying, glorious moment we tried. We saw injustice, and we fought it. We had power, and we used it for others. We were shepherds, not wolves, and we paid the price that shepherds sometimes pay when the wolves are too many and too strong. The republic we loved would give way to empire. The citizen soldiers would become professional armies, loyal to generals rather than the state. The old virtues would fade into memory. All the things we feared came to pass. Rome would eventually fall, consumed by civil wars and power struggles that stemmed partly from the very inequalities we tried to address. We had spoken truth to power, not just in fables and metaphors, but in actual proposed legislation and political action. We had transformed Aesopian language from a tool of survival into a tool of transformation. We had shown that the people could challenge the powerful, that ordinary citizens could demand justice, that the laws could mean something if enough people insisted on it. The land commission we established distributed land to thousands of citizens before it was finally dismantled, and though our immediate reforms were undone, though the wolves seemed to win, we had changed something fundamental. The question I asked as a 12-year-old boy, "Why aren't the laws enforced?" continues to trouble people's consciences. My brother Gaius took up the cause after me, proposing even more ambitious reforms before he too was killed. But here's what the wolves didn't understand, what they never understand. Ideas don't die when people die. The lesson of Aesopian language lives on. The fable of the wolf and the lamb continues to be told. My body, along with the bodies of 300 of my supporters, was thrown into the Tiber. No funeral, no mourning, no honor, just disposal, like we were criminals rather than citizens who had dared to challenge power. And when they came for me, they came with violence rather than votes, with clubs rather than arguments. I died on the Palatine Hill, beaten to death by a mob of senators and their followers. I was 33 years old. For a moment, it seemed like change was possible, like the shepherd could protect the lambs from the wolves, like justice could prevail over power. But the wolves don't give up easily. They gathered their strength, rallied their allies, prepared their counterattack. They saw through the wealthy's Aesopian language of property rights and tradition to the reality underneath. This was about power, about who got to benefit from Rome's conquests, about whether the Republic would serve all its citizens or just the few. The law passed. They recognized that this was about their futures, their families, their ability to live with dignity as Roman citizens. But I had something they didn't expect: genuine support from the people. When I brought my law before the tribal assembly, tens of thousands of ordinary Romans showed up to vote for it. They spread rumors about me, claiming I wanted to be king, that I was betraying my class, that I was a demagogue manipulating the poor for my own ambition. They threatened me, both implicitly and explicitly, to the powerful men who had built their fortunes on appropriating public land. It was an attack on property rights and Roman tradition. They fought me with everything they had. They bribed other tribunes to veto my proposal. But to the wealthy landowners who had grown comfortable breaking those laws, it was revolutionary. To the senators who owned thousands of jugera, it was theft. Establish a commission to oversee the process and ensure it was done fairly. Give Rome's citizens a stake in Rome's success. It was not a radical proposal. Not really. It was simply enforcing laws that had been on the books for over 200 years. The land law I proposed was straightforward. Enforce the existing limits on public land ownership. Reclaim the excess from those who held more than 500 jugera and redistribute it to landless citizens in small plots. They needed someone to stand up for them, to use power for protection rather than exploitation, to be the change that everyone said was impossible. And I thought about all the displaced farmers, all the struggling veterans, all the ordinary Romans who deserved better than what they were getting from their republic. They were counting on me, whether they knew it or not. I thought about my mother, who had shaped me from that moment forward, who had prepared me for this, who had taught me to be a shepherd rather than a wolf. And I thought about the magister who had answered with a fable, teaching me to see the world clearly, to recognize power and its abuses, to understand the language that people use to justify injustice. I thought about that 12-year-old boy who had asked a simple question in a classroom by the temple of Saturn. Why weren't the land laws enforced? Why did the wealthy get to break the rules? Why were lambs devoured while wolves made excuses? This was the heart of the Republic, the place where Rome's destiny was debated and decided, and I was about to ask it to change, to give up what was comfortable and profitable in the name of justice and the common good. They would resist with everything they had. I remember standing in the Forum on the day I took office, looking around at the temples and monuments, the crowds of citizens and the clusters of senators in their distinctive togas with the purple stripe. I had the power now to propose laws. But I also knew that the powerful men I would be challenging would not yield easily. They had grown accustomed to their privileges, had built their fortunes on the very system I wanted to reform. I used Aesopian language, speaking about general principles. While everyone understood, I was talking about specific people and specific injustices. I was elected tribune in 133 BC. It was a moment of triumph, but also of trepidation. Instead, I talked about restoring the values of old Rome, about enforcing the Licinian Sextian laws that our ancestors had wisely enacted, about ensuring that Rome's soldiers had something to fight for, besides the enrichment of the few. Make them the radicals for breaking the old laws, and yourself the conservative for wanting to enforce them. It was brilliant advice, and I followed it. When I announced my candidacy for tribune, I didn't speak of revolution or radical change. Appeal to tradition, to the ancient laws, to Roman virtue. Make it about restoring what once was, not creating something new. You cannot simply accuse the wealthy of breaking the law, of stealing from the poor. They are too powerful, and such direct accusations will only make them close ranks against you. You must speak indirectly, must frame your proposals in language they cannot easily oppose. She helped me plan my campaign, advised me on strategy, connected me with supporters who shared our vision of reform. Remember the lesson of Aesopian language, she told me during one of our strategy sessions. She was old now, her hair completely gray, her face lined with age and grief. Gaius's wife had died young, and my mother felt the loss deeply, but her mind was still sharp, her commitment to Rome's welfare undiminished. The tribunate was a powerful office, with the authority to propose laws, veto Senate actions, and defend citizens from abuses by magistrates. It was the perfect platform for someone who wanted to address Rome's land crisis. My mother supported my decision enthusiastically. Convenient lies, spoken in Aesopian language by wolves trying to justify eating lambs. When I was 30 years old, I decided to run for tribune of the plebs. They argued that any redistribution of land would be theft, would undermine property rights, would destroy the incentives that made Rome great. But I remembered that sleeping farmer from my childhood, and I knew those arguments were lies. The wealthy argued that they were more efficient farmers, that their large estates produced more food, that their success benefited Rome as a whole. They argued that the poor were poor through their own fault, through laziness or incompetence, and those Licinian Sextian laws, limiting public land ownership to 500 jugera, still on the books, still ignored by everyone with the power to ignore them. The wolf's excuses had grown more sophisticated over the centuries, but they were still just excuses. The small farmers who had once formed the backbone of Rome's citizen soldier army were being pushed off the land, forced to crowd into Rome's cities, where they depended on the grain dole and occasional day labor to survive. Rome's conquests were creating enormous amounts of public land, ager publicus, land that theoretically belonged to all Roman citizens, but in practice, this land was being monopolized by wealthy senators and equestrians who used slave labor to work vast estates. But the powerful men in Rome cared more about maintaining their image of invincibility than about the lives of the soldiers I had saved. It was during this period that I began to seriously think about the land problem that had troubled me since that lesson in my childhood. Powerful. I had seen the wolf and the lamb again, but this time I was caught between them. I had tried to do what was right, what would save Roman lives, what would end a pointless conflict. I was eventually spared that fate. But the experience taught me something crucial about Roman politics. Honor mattered less than power. Treaties mattered less than prestige. And even the most legitimate actions could be condemned if they threatened the interests of they wanted to hand me over to the enemy for making an agreement without proper authorization. During a particularly difficult negotiation with the Numantines, I served as quaestor and had to guarantee a treaty with my own honor. It was a humiliating treaty, one that saved a Roman army from destruction but which the Senate later repudiated. Rome was creating an underclass of its own citizens, men who had fought for the Republic but received nothing in return except poverty and marginalization. I saw how wealthy landowners had bought up their properties for almost nothing, consolidating them into vast estates worked by slaves rather than free citizens. It was the displacement I had seen as a 12-year-old boy, but multiplied 1,000-fold. I saw how soldiers who had served Rome faithfully for years returned home to find their farms in ruins, their families in poverty, their futures bleak. It was there, surrounded by the brutality and frustration of a conflict that seemed to have no end and no purpose beyond enriching a few wealthy commanders, that my understanding deepened even further. I remembered the fable. I recognized Aesopian language when I heard Roman orators justifying our actions with high-sounding rhetoric about security and necessity. After Africa, I served in Spain during the Numantine War. Was our justification for the complete destruction of a defeated enemy any more legitimate than the wolf's excuse for eating the lamb? I didn't speak these thoughts aloud. I had learned discretion, had learned when silence was wiser than speech, but I thought them. But I couldn't help wondering, were we the wolf or the lamb in this story? We had been the lamb once, when Hannibal threatened Rome itself, but now, with Carthage defenseless and begging for mercy, had we become the wolf? I watched as Carthage, that ancient rival of Rome, was finally destroyed, its walls pulled down, its inhabitants sold into slavery, its land sown with salt so that nothing would grow there again. It was a moment of supreme Roman triumph, celebrated throughout the Republic. When I was 17, I served my first military campaign in Africa, fighting in the Third Punic War under the command of my brother-in-law Scipio Aemilianus. I saw firsthand the horrors of war and the glory of victory. About recognizing the gap between what Rome claimed to be and what it actually was, about understanding how power operated, how it justified itself, how it could be both critiqued and potentially resisted or reformed. I learned to ride horses and throw javelins, to wrestle and swim, to comport myself as a Roman aristocrat. But more than any specific skill or knowledge, What stayed with me was the lesson about truly seeing the world around me. Days seemed long, but years flew by. I grew taller, my voice deepened, my understanding of the world expanded. I studied Greek philosophy and Roman law, rhetoric and mathematics, history and poetry. They took over much of my education from the school at the Forum, though I continued to attend occasionally to maintain social connections with boys my own age. The years passed with that strange combination of slowness and speed that characterizes childhood. The Greek teachers my mother had hired finally arrived from Athens. Blasius, a stoic philosopher with penetrating eyes and a habit of asking uncomfortable questions, and Diophanes, a master of rhetoric who could make even the driest subject come alive with his eloquence. These thoughts haunted me like shadows, never quite leaving my consciousness, even when I tried to focus on the present moment. After Saturnalia ended, life returned to its normal patterns. The fable of the wolf and the lamb kept returning to me, along with the magister's words about Aesopian language and my mother's charge to be a shepherd rather than a wolf. For one day, master and slave could almost pretend to be equals. Almost. But even as I laughed and played and celebrated, part of my mind remained with the lesson I had learned days before. I participated in the festivities, playing dice with Gaius and even serving Spendius his dinner as custom demanded. He looked uncomfortable with the role reversal, as he always did during Saturnalia, but he played along. Gifts were exchanged, particularly simple wax candles and clay figurines. The wealthy served their slaves, at least symbolically. It was chaos and joy and release, a brief respite from the rigid hierarchies that governed the rest of the Roman year. For one day, as tradition dictated, the normal order of society was inverted. Slaves wore the pileus, the cap of freedom, and dined at the same tables as their masters. Gambling, usually restricted, was permitted. If you enjoyed learning about this piece of history, give this video a thumbs up, subscribe for more fascinating stories, and let me know in the comments which historical period you'd like to explore next. Saturnalia came and went in a blur of feasting and celebration, and when that day came, he would remember this lesson, this conversation, this moment of awakening. Someday, he would have to choose. The great city carried on, indifferent to the thoughts of one 12-year-old boy lying on his bed and contemplating the future. But someday, I thought, someday that boy would be a man. Someday he would have power of his own, and that decision, that choice about what kind of person to become, what kind of Roman to be, that would define the rest of my life. Outside my window, I could hear the sounds of Rome continuing its daily life. Voices calling, carts rumbling, dogs barking, children playing. It was also about recognizing injustice in the first place, about understanding the gap between how things were and how they should be. Once you saw that gap, once you truly understood it, you could not simply ignore it. You had to decide what to do about it. But I knew one thing. I could not simply accept the world as it was. Not anymore. Not after today. The lesson of Aesopian language was not just about how to speak indirectly about injustice. Would I be a lamb, powerless in the face of injustice? Or could I be what my mother suggested, a shepherd, using whatever power I had to protect rather than exploit? I didn't know. I was 12 years old, and the future seemed both infinitely distant and terrifyingly close. I had been given a new way of seeing, a new way of understanding, and with that new understanding came new obligations, new possibilities, new fears. What kind of Roman would I become? Would I be a wolf, using power for my own benefit? This was my private space, my refuge. I lay down on my bed and stared at the ceiling, trying to process everything. The day had started normally enough, a walk to school, a lesson, a walk home, but somewhere in that ordinary sequence, something extraordinary had happened. There was a bed with wool blankets, a small desk where I did my homework, a few stools, and shelves for my writing materials and the scrolls I was studying. The walls were painted a simple cream color, without the elaborate frescoes that decorated the public rooms. Then I left her study and made my way to my own room, my mind still spinning with everything I had heard and learned and felt. My room was modest compared to some of the other rooms in the house, but it was comfortable. But remember what you learned today. Keep it in your heart. Let it shape how you see the world and how you imagine your place in it. I stood and bowed to her, as was proper for a son to do to his mother, even a mother as informal and philosophically inclined as Cornelia. I'll try to be worthy of our family, of what you're teaching me. I know you will, she said, squeezing my shoulder gently. Now, go. Rest. Tomorrow is Saturnalia, and you should enjoy it. There will be time enough for serious matters after the festival. I had seen behind the curtain, had understood something fundamental about how Rome worked and how it didn't work. I could not unsee it, could not unknow it, and with that knowledge came responsibility. I'll try, Mother, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Part of me wanted to be just a boy again, concerned only with games and lessons and the next festival. But another part of me, a part that was perhaps always there but which had been awakened today, understood that there was no going back. The emotions of the day, the walk through Rome's streets, the lesson about power and injustice, the fable of the wolf and the lamb, this conversation with my mother were all overwhelming. I was being asked to see too much, understand too much, prepare for too much. You carry our name, our history, our future. It is a heavy burden for a 12-year-old boy, but I believe you can bear it. I believe you can become the man Rome needs. I felt tears prickling at the corners of my eyes, though I tried to hide them. Your father's death was difficult for all of us, but it also means that you must grow up faster than you might have otherwise. You are the head of this family now. In a way, not in legal authority, you're too young for that, but in spirit. Rome will need leaders who remember the lessons they learned as boys, who remember what justice means, who remember that power is meant to serve rather than to dominate. She stood and came around the desk, placing her hand on my shoulder. Before you know it, you will be old enough to take the toga virilis, to enter public life, to stand for office. And when that time comes, you must be ready. The problems will not have solved themselves. If anything, they will have grown worse. I can barely change what I eat for breakfast. My mother smiled. A genuine smile this time. Warm and affectionate. You are only 12 now, yes. But you will not always be 12. Time passes quickly, my son. You must also learn how to act, how to use whatever power you have for good purposes. how to be the change you wish to see. But I'm only 12, I protested. I can't change Rome. He taught you to see how power operates, how it justifies itself, how it can be both critiqued and resisted through careful language. This is valuable knowledge, but you must go beyond critique. You must understand Rome's problems, Rome's potential, and your own capacity to make a difference. She rolled up the scroll of Polybius and set it aside. Your teacher today gave you a gift, Tiberius. You may choose a military career or a political one, or perhaps something else entirely. But whatever you choose, you must be ready. I am preparing you to serve Rome, she corrected. Politics is one path of service, but not the only one. Your grandfather served in the army and in the Senate. Your father served as praetor, consul, censor. Diophanes of Mytilene is a rhetorician who can teach you how to persuade, how to speak to assemblies, how to move people with words as well as with logic. You're preparing me to enter politics, I said, the realization dawning. They are philosophers who have thought deeply about justice, about good government, about the responsibilities of those who have power. Blasius of Cumae is a Stoic who believes that the wealthy have a moral obligation to use their resources for the common good. She was preparing me for something, shaping me toward some future role that she envisioned but had not yet fully revealed. The Greek teachers I have written to, she continued, shifting the subject slightly,
they are not just scholars.
Problem. If you are educated properly, if you understand what you have seen today, if you choose to be shepherds rather than wolves. The weight of her expectations settled on me like a physical thing. She wasn't just teaching me, wasn't just educating me. I believe that laws should mean something, that justice should be more than a word, that power should come with responsibility. She paused, then added with quiet intensity, and I believe that my sons, you and Gaius, can be part of the solution rather than part of the... I believe that a republic where only the few prosper while the many suffer is not sustainable. But he was limited by his time, by his position, by the expectations of his class. And you? I asked. What do you believe? I believe that Rome's greatness depends on the well-being of all Romans, not just the elite. He built a city, Gracchus, named after our family, not as a monument to himself, but as a place where people could live and work in security. He believed in the old Roman values of moderation, duty, justice. That, she said quietly, is the question that defines a generation. Your father tried, in his way. He worked to bring peace to Hispania, to create stable conditions where Roman and Spanish alike could prosper. If the powerful won't enforce the laws that limit their own power, how can anything change? She looked at me with an expression I had never quite seen before, something between hope and sorrow, between encouragement and warning. The displaced farmers were the lambs, unable to defend themselves against power, and Rome was letting it happen, was complicit in it, was perhaps even designed to allow it. Mother, I said, what can anyone do about this? And so the laws exist but are not enforced, and the problems grow worse. I thought about the wolf and the lamb again. The wealthy landowners were the wolves, making excuses for why they deserve to keep their vast estates. The Senate is filled with men who benefit from ignoring those laws. The magistrates? They too are from the wealthy class. The assemblies could pass new laws. But the wealthy have ways of blocking or circumventing them. The gap grows wider every year. But what about the land laws? I asked. The Licinian Sextian laws that Marcus recited today. Don't they limit how much land someone can have? They do on paper, but who enforces them? The Senate? Rome is filling with displaced farmers, landless veterans, citizens who have nothing but their citizenship. And meanwhile, the wealthy buy up more and more land, use more and more slave labor, accumulate more and more wealth. He should be rewarded. Should? My mother repeated, echoing what Spendius had said earlier. Yes, he should be. But he isn't. And there are thousands like him. Tens of thousands. He has nothing now except the slim hope that someone might hire him for day labor, or that the grain dole will keep him from starving. That's not fair, I said, feeling the anger rise in me again as it had during the lesson. He shouldn't be punished for serving Rome, its problems. You saw that displaced farmer this morning. Spendius told me about him. That man probably served Rome faithfully for years. He probably fought in one of our wars, risking his life for the Republic. And what was his reward? His land was taken from him. Increasingly, it flows to those who already have much, while those who fought to win it, the soldiers, the farmers who leave their land to serve in the legions, receive less and less. She gestured to the window, beyond which lay the city of Rome with all its grandeur and all, something more divided, more unequal, more focused on private gain than public good. The conquest of Greece, of Asia, of Africa, these victories have brought enormous wealth into Rome. But where does that wealth go? But there was also a sense of collective purpose, a feeling that Rome's greatness depended on the strength and prosperity of all its citizens, not just the wealthy few. And now, I prompted when she fell silent, now I see Rome becoming something different. I have watched Rome change over my lifetime. When I was young, when my father was at the height of his power, Rome was still recognizably the republic of old. Yes, there were inequalities. There were injustices. There always have been. You are the heir to all of this. You will have opportunities that most Romans never dream of. The question is, what will you do with those opportunities? She paused, letting her words sink in. Then she continued, her voice softer but no less intense. You're saying that power itself isn't bad. It's how power is used that matters. Exactly. Your family has power, Tiberius. We have wealth, connections, a distinguished history. Your father was consul twice. Your grandfather defeated Hannibal and saved Rome. He uses power. Yes, he has a staff. He has dogs. He has authority over his flock, but he uses that power for protection, not exploitation. He is strong, but his strength serves a purpose beyond his own enrichment. Do you understand? I think so, I said slowly. You are being raised to be a shepherd. I must have looked puzzled because she smiled slightly and elaborated. A shepherd protects the lambs from the wolves. It describes tyranny and victimhood, but not the possibility of something better. She leaned forward, her intensity almost overwhelming. But you, Tiberius, you are being raised to be neither wolf nor lamb. Or, and this is what I hope, will you be something else entirely? What else is there? I asked, genuinely confused. A fable only has two characters. Precisely. That is the limitation of the fable. It shows us the problem but not the solution. He showed you how the powerful make excuses for doing whatever they wish. But he also, I suspect, was asking you an implicit question. What kind of Roman will you be? Will you be a wolf or a lamb? When power becomes divorced from responsibility, when ambition overrides virtue, when expansion proceeds without regard for justice, then the seeds of decline are sown. She looked up at me. Your teacher showed you a fable about a wolf and a lamb, he writes. My mother continued, finding the passage she wanted. Rome's greatness comes not from its military strength alone, but from its ability to balance power with responsibility, ambition with virtue, expansion with justice. But this balance is fragile. I had heard of Polybius. Of course, he was famous for his histories of Rome's wars, but I had not yet read his works. He was a friend of your grandfather, Scipio Africanus, and later became part of the household of Scipio Aemilianus, your uncle by marriage. Do you know what he writes about power and justice in Rome? I shook my head. Her fingers traced along a row of scrolls until she found the one she wanted. She pulled it out and returned to her desk, unrolling it partially. This is a letter from Polybius, she said. The Greek historian, how to recognize when people are speaking truth and when they are merely justifying their actions with convenient excuses. This is essential knowledge for anyone who wishes to lead. She stood and walked to one of the shelves that lined the walls of her study. Then she spoke, and her words would stay with me for the rest of my life. You have learned something important today, my mother said, her voice measured and thoughtful. Your teacher has shown you how to see beneath the surface of things, and as I spoke, I saw something in her expression satisfaction, perhaps, or recognition, as if this was exactly what she had hoped I would learn, exactly the kind of education she wanted me to receive. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, considering, and then I began to tell her about the Aesopian language, about the wolf and the lamb, about power and justice, about the questions I had asked and the answers I had received. She listened without interruption, her eyes never leaving my face, absorbing every word. Like everything about her, her appearance suggested dignity and substance, rather than frivolous display. Tiberius, she said, gesturing to a stool near her desk, sit. Tell me about your day at school. I sat and took a breath, organizing my thoughts. Her dark eyes were sharp and penetrating, seeming to see through any evasion or half-truth. Her face was strong rather than delicate, conveying intelligence and determination. She wore a simple stola of fine wool, with minimal jewelry. Cornelia, daughter of Scipio Africanus, widow of Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus, mother of, she hoped, future leaders of Rome. She was perhaps 40 years old, though age had not dimmed her beauty or her intensity. It was smaller than most rooms in the house, but packed with scrolls and tablets. My mother sat at a desk, a wax tablet before her, a stylus in her hand. She had been writing something, but she set the stylus down as I entered and turned her full attention to me. The Greek teachers she was trying to hire were just the latest step in this lifelong project. I knocked on the door of her study and heard her voice call out, "Enter." I pushed open the door and stepped into the room. She had educated herself, studying Greek literature and philosophy, corresponding with scholars, reading everything she could find. She was, people said, the most learned woman in Rome, and she was determined that her sons would be equally well educated. She would want to know, would want to hear about what I had learned, and unlike most mothers in Rome, who concerned themselves primarily with domestic matters and left education to men, my mother took an active, intense interest in her son's intellectual development. I made my way through the atrium toward my mother's study, a small room where she conducted household business and pursued her own considerable scholarly interests. As I walked, I thought about what I would tell her about today's lesson. The contradiction was uncomfortable, but I was beginning to understand that Rome was full of such contradictions. He was a slave, I was his master, and no amount of philosophical discussion could change that fundamental fact. Yet he was also my teacher in ways that went beyond his official duties. She has something she wishes to discuss with you. I nodded and handed him my box of writing implements. Thank you, Spendius, for everything. He bowed slightly, a gesture of respect that felt hollow given our conversation. I was beginning to grasp that being born into a privileged family brought not just advantages, but also responsibilities, or at least, it should bring responsibilities. Your mother asked that you come to her study when you returned from school, Spendius informed me, but I was also, I realized, becoming aware of it in a new way. I was seeing the contrast between this and the sleeping farmer on the street. I was understanding that my comfort came at least partly from a system that created such disparities. Potted plants added touches of green, and bronze statues stood in alcoves. This was the home of a wealthy, powerful family. This was privilege made physical, and I was part of it, benefiting from it every day of my life. The floor was paved with colorful tiles in geometric patterns. The walls were painted with frescoes showing scenes from mythology. In the center, the impluvium caught rainwater, its surface reflecting the sky visible through the opening in the roof. And so wisdom survives, even when the wise themselves are long dead. I stepped through the doorway into the atrium of our home. The contrast with the streets outside was immediate and stark. Here, everything was ordered, clean, beautiful. Not the power of armies or wealth, but the power of recognition. When we hear a truth that resonates with our own experience, we remember it. We pass it on. We tell our children, and a slave who became free would want to teach others what he had learned about the nature of tyranny and justice. And people still remember his fables hundreds of years later. Yes, because truth, young master, even when spoken indirectly, has power of its own. Whether they are literally true or not, I cannot say. But it would make sense, wouldn't it? A slave would understand power and powerlessness very well. A slave would need to learn Aesopian language just to survive. He stood and bowed as we approached, then pushed the door open. Spendius, I said, pausing before entering. The magister said that Aesop might have been a slave. Is that true? So the stories say, young master? It means helping you understand the world as it truly is, not as we wish it to be. We had reached the entrance to our family's mansion. The heavy wooden door was closed, but a slave porter sat on a stool beside it, ready to admit us. Thank you, I said quietly, for answering honestly. It is my duty to educate you, young master. Your mother hired me for that purpose. And education means more than grammar and poetry. He had said Rome was neither all good nor all bad, neither perfectly just nor completely unjust. He had avoided direct criticism that might get him or me in trouble, while still conveying the complexity and the problems. He had been honest without being reckless, and within Rome itself, justice depends greatly on who you are, how much power you have, and whether the law happens to benefit or harm those in authority. I absorbed this, recognizing that Spendius had just given me an answer using Aesopian language. Rome prosecutes wars of conquest that enrich the few while impoverishing the many. Rome speaks of justice while tolerating profound injustice. So is Rome just? He shrugged. It is more just than some societies, less just than others. A brave soldier can win glory regardless of his birth. These things matter. He paused, and I sensed the but coming. But, Spendius continued, Rome also enslaves millions of people. Rome allows the wealthy to accumulate vast estates, while citizens go landless. Justice is complicated. Rome has laws, and many of them are admirable. Rome has traditions of civic virtue and public service. Rome offers paths to advancement that are rare in other societies. A plebeian can become consul. It has conquered half the known world, brought law and order to countless peoples, created monuments that will last for centuries. These are remarkable accomplishments. That's not what I asked. No, he agreed. You asked if Rome is just. That is a different question. Finally, he spoke, choosing his words with obvious care. Rome is a great power, young master. It has achieved things that no other city-state has achieved. I wasn't ready to arrive yet. Wasn't ready to end this conversation. Of course, young master. Do you think Rome is just? Do you think our republic is fair? My pedagogue was quiet for a long time, long enough that I thought he might not answer. My mother preferred a certain restraint in display, a republican simplicity that harked back to earlier, supposedly more virtuous times. Spendius, can I ask you something? I said, slowing my pace as we approached our home. These were the homes of Rome's elite, families that had held power for generations. My family's mansion was here, though not the largest or most ostentatious, one that I hope you will never need, but which is useful to understand nonetheless. We had reached the residential area of the Palatine now, where the streets widened and the buildings became more imposing. I learned to be indirect, to suggest rather than state, to let people draw their own conclusions. It is a survival skill, young master. It was too personal a question, too direct, but Spendius didn't seem offended. He admitted, when I was first captured and sold, I was young and angry and foolish. I spoke my mind directly, and I was punished for it. Eventually, I learned. Your listeners understand what you really mean, but your enemies cannot quite accuse you of sedition because you're only telling an innocent story about animals. Is that how you survived being a slave? I asked. Then immediately wished I could take the words back. When you cannot speak truth openly without risking punishment, you learn to speak truth indirectly. You tell stories. You make comparisons. You speak in allegories. He said it's a way of talking about injustice when you can't speak directly, using fables and metaphors instead of direct accusations. Is that something you Greeks do? Spendius smiled slightly. It is something all powerless people do, young master. Not just Greeks, but I felt as though I was seeing it all differently now, as though the Magister's lesson had given me a new lens through which to view the world. The Magister said something about Aesopian language. We passed a slave leading a donkey laden with amphorae, probably wine or oil being delivered to one of the mansion. We passed a priest hurrying toward a temple, his white robes gleaming in the sunlight. Ordinary life, continuing as it always did. The question is, what do you do with that knowledge? We walked in silence for a while. The streets were quieter here. Away from the forum, we passed a group of women returning from the market, their baskets full of vegetables and bread. Laws should matter. Justice should matter, not just power. Should, Spendius agreed. That is an important word, young master. The world should work according to justice, but often it works according to power instead. The wolf does not need a legitimate reason to eat the lamb. His power is reason enough, but he pretends to have legitimate grievances because even tyrants like to think of themselves as just. But that's wrong, I protested. That's a terrible way for the world to work. The Magister used it to explain something about power and justice, about how the powerful make excuses for doing what they want, even when it's wrong. Spendius nodded slowly. Ah, your teacher is a wise man, then. That is indeed what Aesop teaches in that fable. Spendius, I finally said as we left the forum and began climbing back toward the Palatine, do you know Aesop's fable about the wolf and the lamb? Of course, young master. It is one of his most famous stories. Why do you ask? We studied it today, and I wondered. Was everyone either a wolf or a lamb? Was there no middle ground? No way to be neither predator nor prey? Powerless, exploited, unable to defend themselves against injustice. The world seemed suddenly full of wolves and lambs. Everywhere I looked, I saw power being exercised, excuses being made, injustices being committed or endured. That wealthy senator being carried through the crowd in his litter, his slaves struggling to make way for him. He was certainly wolf-like in his casual display of power and privilege. But those slaves carrying him, they were surely lambs, weren't they? That merchant arguing with a customer over the price of fish, was he like the wolf, using his power as vendor to extract unfair prices? Or was he the lamb, trying to make an honest living while larger forces squeezed him? It was magnificent and sordid, inspiring and depressing, all at the same time. As we walked, I found myself observing everything with new eyes. This was the heart of the Republic, where all the different threads of Roman life came together: commerce and politics, religion and entertainment, wealth and poverty, free and enslaved, patrician and plebeian. At the other end, a politician was giving a speech from the rostra, though I couldn't make out his words over the general din. This was Rome at its most vibrant and chaotic. Street vendors called out their wares: fresh bread, roasted chestnuts, fish sauce, wool garments, pottery, jewelry, herbs. Legal proceedings were underway at one end of the forum, where lawyers in flowing togas gestured dramatically while crowds gathered to watch. He knew when to press for information and when to give me space to think. We navigated through the crowded forum, which had reached its midday peak of activity. The noise was overwhelming, hundreds of voices talking, arguing, laughing. conducting business. I was still processing what had happened, still trying to organize my thoughts about the lesson, the fable, the concept of Aesopian language. Spendius, noting my unusual silence, simply fell into step beside me as we began the walk home. It was his habitual question, asked every day without fail. Usually, I gave a brief, non-committal answer. Fine, Spendius. Or, we studied Greek conjugations. Or, the magister was in a foul mood. Today, I didn't answer immediately. His lamp was no longer necessary. The winter sun, though pale, provided more than enough light, but he still carried it, along with a small bag containing some bread and cheese in case I was hungry after lessons. "How was your class, young master?" he asked as I reached him. Spendius was waiting for me outside the school, standing with the cluster of other pedagogues who had accompanied their young charges to the forum. As I emerged from behind the linen curtain, he straightened up and made his way toward me through the crowd. Something fundamental had shifted in my understanding. I had learned about Aesopian language, and I would never hear stories or laws, or speeches, or justifications in quite the same way again.